The trouble started the summer my quiet valley stopped being quiet. For nearly 40 years, I had owned the land that sat at the base of Blackwood Ridge, a sweeping stretch of meadow and woodland fed by a narrow river that curved into a small man-made reservoir. My father and I had built the dam decades earlier, more for irrigation than anything else, but over the years that water had become the heart of my property. Ducks came every spring, trout made a home there, and the stillness of the reservoir gave me peace after my wife passed. It wasn't grand land in the eyes of most developers. Rocky in places, too remote for city commuters, too plain for tourists. But to me, it was a sanctuary, one that carried the weight of memories and the whispers of family history. My parents had lived and died here, and I had grown older here, content with its quiet. So you can imagine my shock when one afternoon I drove back from town and saw bulldozers gnawing at the edge of my property. Dust clouds rose like smoke, men in hard hats shouted, and heavy equipment groaned and clattered across ground that, last I checked, carried my name on the deed. I stopped my truck so abruptly the gravel spid against the fenders. I got out, walked past a temporary fence, and yelled at the first man I saw. He looked at me with confusion at first, then irritation, as though I were the intruder. When I asked what they were doing, he answered flatly, "Clearing for homes. HOA project. Phase 1. Homes. HOA. Phase 1. I felt my chest tighten. Within a month, structures rose like mushrooms after rain. They worked day and night, their trucks chewing ruts into my fields, their saws screaming over the cries of birds. I tried to protest, of course. I went to the county office, waving my deed and papers that proved I had owned this land since the late 70s. They shrugged. "We'll look into it," they said, and nothing happened. I hired a lawyer, but the HOA, flush with money and political favors, had an army of attorneys to drown a man like me in paperwork and delays. By the time we filed motions, 35 houses stood like soldiers across the meadow that had once been my father's grazing pasture. The families came soon after. Shiny SUVs, tidy lawns rolled out like carpets, plastic playhouses in backyards. It was as though a slice of suburban life had been dropped into my valley, with their manicured hedges and HOA signs reminding everyone of community standards. But here's the truth of it. They built those homes without ever owning the dirt beneath them. Every nail, every brick, every porch swing, it all sat on land that didn't belong to them. To me, it was theft of the highest order. And while I could have raged and fought with fists, something in me stayed quiet, waiting. Because I had something they didn't know. Something that went unnoticed by their eager developers and smug HOA board. That reservoir, held back by a dam of stone and steel, wasn't just a pretty pond. It was a keystone. The water table in that valley ran beneath it, and the dam controlled where that water went. Over the years, during floods, I had watched the power of that water scour the earth clean, turn soil to rivers, and cut trenches where there hadn't been any before. I knew its moods, its pressure, its silent weight. I didn't build the dam to hurt anyone. But as I watched those homes rise, as I listened to HOA representatives knock on my door and tell me, with smirks, that perhaps I should sell out while prices were high, I began to realize they had built their kingdom on a fragile throne. They thought they owned me. They thought they could erase a lifetime of work with the stroke of a pen. And then came the day one of their board members, a woman with clipped speech and pearls around her neck, informed me that my dam was unsightly and unsafe. She stood on my porch, tapping her high-heeled foot against old pine planks my father once hammered in, and told me the HOA had voted that I must remove the dam, as though they had the right, as though they could command history to bend. I smiled, I remember that, smiled and closed the door gently, because the decision was already stirring inside me. I waited until late autumn, after the last of the summer heat had dried the grass to straw, and the reservoir was swollen with weeks of rain. I walked out one night with a lantern and my toolbox, the moon pale above the ridgeline. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold stone. I placed my hand against the rough wall of the dam, felt the rumble of water pressing behind it. It took me hours, working quietly, undoing bolts, loosening gates, opening the release in a way that wouldn't stop until the earth itself gave way. When the final pin slid out, the sound was like the breath of a giant exhaling after decades of silence. The water roared forward, a beast freed from its cage. It poured into the valley, carving through soil and brush, sweeping across the meadow with unstoppable force. By dawn, the houses were sitting in pools of mud, driveways fractured, basements filled like bathtubs. Fences leaned drunkenly, swing sets half submerged, lawns shredded into ribbons. I stood on the ridge and watched, not with glee, but with a cold, steady calm. It wasn't vengeance, not entirely. It was balance. The land was reminding them whose bones it rested on, whose roots stretched beneath. The lawsuits came, of course. The HOA dragged me into court, accused me of sabotage, of terrorism even. But when my lawyer stood and held up the deed, when the county clerk confirmed the property lines, when the engineers testified that the dam was mine to control, the courtroom grew still. The judge, a man who had once fished trout with me in that very reservoir, looked over his glasses and declared that I had simply exercised my rights as a landowner. The silence that followed was sweeter than any applause. Families fled. The homes, warped with water damage, mildewed and unsellable, stood empty for years, monuments to arrogance. Grass grew tall around them, vines crawled up their siding, and the wind rattled their hollow frames. Eventually, the county marked them for demolition. One by one, they fell until the valley returned to something resembling the place I once knew. I rebuilt parts of the dam, not fully, just enough to let the reservoir remain without threatening the land again. Ducks returned, trout swam. The air smelled once more of pine and wet stone instead of asphalt and exhaust. Sometimes I sit on my porch with a mug of coffee and watch the sun slide across the valley. I think of my father, his calloused hands guiding me as we set those first stones in the dam wall. I think of my wife, her laughter echoing across the water as she hung laundry on the line. I think of the arrogance of men who believe paper and signatures can own what generations of sweat and care built. And I think of the lesson in all of it. You can build 35 homes, pave roads, hang lights, and declare authority with boards and votes. But if you forget the foundation, if you forget the earth beneath your feet, you will lose it all. Nature doesn't care for HOA bylaws. Land remembers who tends it, and it does not bend easily to greed. Now, younger folks sometimes stop by, curious about the valley and its stories. They ask if it's true, if I really flooded our neighborhood. I don't tell them yes or no. I just smile, sip my coffee, and remind them to respect what they stand on, to honor what came before them, to know that some things can't be bought, and some debts must be paid in full. The valley is quiet again, my quiet, and I intend to keep it that way until my last breath.